Vnrc will be co-hosting with Vermont conservation voters about our priorities for the coming year. And these priorities not only address climate change through the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by transitioning away from our reliance on fossil fuels or mitigation, but also working to prepare Vermont for the changes to our climate that are already occurring and that are projected to continue occurring because of the amount of carbon that's also been released, that's already been released into the atmosphere. I expect most people on the call are familiar with the Vermont Climate Assessment that the University of Vermont released last year. That study found that the state's average annual temperature has warmed by nearly 2 degrees Fahrenheit, and precipitation has increased by over 20% over the past century. These changes to a warmer, wetter Vermont, which are projected to continue, are going to have a tremendous impact on our communities and natural resources in the coming decades. Much of the work that Vnrc is doing and will be discussing is not necessarily new, but builds upon work that we've been doing for the past several years. Most noteworthy, 2 years ago, one of our legislative priorities was enacting the Global Warming Solutions Act, which became law in 2020. And that law established statutory greenhouse gas emissions reductions goals for the state, and it created the Vermont Climate Council, which met over the past year and a half and adopted a climate action plan for the state just last month. While the plan is not perfect, it does set a course for not only mitigating climate change through reduction of fossil fuel use, but also seeks to prepare Vermont for a warmer world through a whole range of strategies related to river management, wetland and floodplain protection, forest health, smart growth, transportation, and soil management. Really, the intent of that is to make Vermont a more resilient state in the face of climate change. So what we're going to do today is we're going to first hear from VNRC's Energy and Climate Action Program Director, Johanna Miller, who served on the Climate Council, who's going to provide an overview of the Climate Action Plan and the work ahead to implement it. And at a later date, she's going to be hosting another webinar in this series to discuss VNRC's climate mitigation priorities. Also today, we're going to hear from John Groveman, who in addition to running VNRC's water program, helps coordinate our policy agenda. And he's going to discuss how we define resilience and what we can do to help Vermont adapt to the changes underway in our climate and our state. And then finally, we're going to hear from Sheldon Goodwin, the political outreach director for our partner, the Vermont Conservation Voters, about VCV's role in implementing the Climate Action Plan and the broader environmental community's agenda that's going to be spelled out in the soon to be released Environmental Common Agenda. And then hopefully we'll have time for questions at the end. And we'll also be announcing that our next webinar will be on Friday, the 21st at noon, and that's going to focus on water-related issues and how water quality plugs into our resilience over time. So Joey, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Brian. I'm going to share my screen, and so glad to be here with you all today for taking the time. Just going to start the slideshow. Hope you can see me all right. Yeah, I'm Johanna Miller, Energy and Climate Program Director at VNRC. As Brian noted, I'm the House appointed representing the environmental community, which is a big humbling and role to play. So it's been a big piece of work. I'm gonna talk a little bit about the Climate Council and the Climate Action Plan. Many of you have heard about it, but you know, this is sort of our view. As Brian said, this is our long work, and we are very much looking at this as the blueprint that it is for our work at VNRC and for the state of Vermont. So a little bit of context I wanted to just provide. Many of you are likely well aware. I mean, the leading climate scientists globally, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, tells us that we have until 2030 to cut our collective combustion of fossil fuels in half. So we have a lot of work to do in the mitigation space. Vermont has been focused on climate action for a long time. We've taken some significant strides, particularly in the electric sector, which we have regulated, but we've had goals in place since 2006. We've consistently and significantly flown by and missed those targets. But as you know, as Brian articulated, we have this new framework in place, the Climate Action Plan and the Global Warming Solutions Act, that does require the first statutory endeavor to require progress and set forth a broad overarching framework to look at hard pollution reductions as well as mitigation, adaptation and resilience. So in terms of what is in the plan, high level, the plan aims to cut climate pollution 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. That's what we have outlined in this initial plan. Importantly, it prioritizes, as it must, those who are most impacted now and historically lower income, historically overburdened Vermonters. The plan that was put forward and adopted, that initial plan, was shaped largely by the work in the 5 subcommittees. Those subcommittees were cross-sector mitigation, the mitigation, sort of the sectoral energy sector, dealing with transportation, thermal, electricity, and non-energy issues. And then 4 other subcommittees, including agriculture and ecosystems, rural resilience and adaptation, science and data, and really critically, the work of the Just Transition Subcommittee as an overarching framework. The plan was informed by public input and public engagement opportunities, though much more work will be done to continue to inform iterations of this plan, as well as the programs and the policies that come out of it. The plan was also in conjunction with the Comprehensive Energy Plan, which is also on a nearly parallel path to being updated. And so there was deep coordination there. And the plan is required to be updated at least every 4 years, though it can be updated more regularly than that. Quickly, the charge, the Global Warming Solutions Act does set that very broad, necessarily overarching framework for climate action. Again, the hard pollution reductions in the transportation, building, regulated utility, industrial, commercial, and agricultural sectors. And it also speaks to the need to focus on our land use strategies through smart growth, achieving long-term sequestration and storage of carbon through our natural resources, through our forests, through our farmlands, through best management practices. It sets a target and a requirement to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. It really does, again, focus on centering equity in the work that we do, reducing energy burdens for rural and marginalized communities. And again, focusing on, as John is going to dig into, the adaptation and resilience component of this work. The only legal accountability tool currently in the plan is the hard pollution reductions by 2025, 2030, and 2050, but necessarily it is a really important framework, and looking forward to implementing it with you all. This is just a high-level overview of the equity lens that we have to date applied to the work thus far. But again, thanks. We have a lot more work to do in this arena, but thanks to the incredible work of the Just Transition Subcommittee, we now have this rigorous framework that we can and will and must apply to our ensuing work. And it's gaining momentum in the legislature as a framework to apply to the policies and the programs that are being considered there as well. So if you have not yet seen the guiding principles for the Just Transition outlined, I would highly encourage you to do so. The plan at a high level has 5 impact areas. I highlighted them in large part, again, cutting climate pollution, and then the work in the resilience and adaptation space through, leaning into our resilient and working natural lands, capturing carbon, ensuring we create vital communities, protecting people and infrastructure from climate impacts, and creating places where people can live close to where they work and play. And then the plan also has this cross-cutting solutions identified, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Again, this is the resilience and adaptation component of the plan, as I just highlighted, and John is going to dig into that and what that means for our work at Vnrc, and we hope our work collectively across the beautiful state of Vermont. In the cross-cutting solutions area, I would just note that, the way the Climate Council was organized through the work of the subcommittees, largely, it became abundantly clear that things like land use and smart growth were recognized as a priority and an opportunity and a need across each of the issue subcommittees. cross-sector, rural resilience and adaptation, and agriculture and ecosystems really identified smart land use strategies, smart growth, and the protection of our rural resources as a pivotal component for climate action. There was also recognition in the cross-cutting solutions work that we need to really invest in workforce, that we need to build the clean energy workforce to actually do this work, that we need to invest in the people power to do this work, whether that be in state government or in key partner organizations like regional planning commissions, community action agencies, and other community partner organizations who are working with and serving Vermonters locally. The cross-cutting solutions also identified the need for education and personal action. So it was really a really overarching important component to the plan that really recognizes the breadth of what we need to do to actually make these recommendations and priorities possible. In the mitigation space, the hard reductions from transportation, buildings, energy, and products, I would just point you to, many of you have likely seen this a bunch, which is our friends at the Energy Action Network have given us this image of how far we need to go to make progress in our pollution reduction space. And the long and the short of it is, as you can see at the end of this chart, here we are. We have a long way to go. And so now we have this framework in place to actually get there. When it comes to reducing pollution, the lion's share of where our pollution comes from in this beautiful rural state is through and in the transportation sector. About 40% of the collective pollution that we create comes from how we get where we need to go. The next biggest component of pollution comes from our buildings, how we heat the places we live, work, et cetera. And then the agriculture, industrial processes, electric sector, and waste management sectors. So the plan in through the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee really focused on how are we going to tackle those sectors, and we rigorously applied to inform the recommendations that we ultimately put forward this prioritization framework. It was a framework that we adopted across the subcommittees, and in the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee applied it. And those prioritization criteria included impact and progress towards our pollution reduction requirements, justice and equity, an identification of and consideration of the co-benefits like public health benefits, job creation, et cetera. Cost effectiveness, how do we ensure that this is cost effective and we mitigate any potential upward cost pressures to Vermonters in the way that we design programs and deliver benefits. And then lastly, technical feasibility. Can we actually put electric vehicles on the roads, put rural Uber systems on the roads? Can we actually deliver to Vermonters? So just a couple more slides. It was a whole ton of work, and the strategies that we put forward are likely not to be new or surprising. We generally have known this is where we need to focus, but the CAP really outlined and focused in on pollutions reductions that prioritize reducing our consumption of energy through really significant building efficiency and weatherization investments. So that's in the building space. The reduction of energy was also a really critical component in the transportation arena, and as well through more efficient vehicles, reducing vehicle miles traveled in the transportation sector, giving people options to get where they need to go beyond their vehicle. So, and that was across the board, and the different sectors really focused on efficiency. The CAP also prioritizes the need to electrify a lot of light duty vehicles, trucks, transit, buses, et cetera. And to enable that electrification, building the charging infrastructure that actually makes that possible, and applying the equity lens, really prioritizing multifamily dwellings and workplaces in that build out of our charging networks. Quickly, the plan also looks to fuel switching, helping Vermonters move to cleaner heat for their homes, whether that be through advanced wood heat or cold climate heat pumps. And the sort of cornerstone priority in the plan is the clean heat standard, which is a little bit analogous to a renewable portfolio standard, setting targets to begin to ratchet down the fossil fuel intensity of the heat we deliver to Vermonters through a variety of different solutions. Again, advanced wood heat, cold climate heat pumps, weatherization, et cetera. And to make this transition possible, both in the transportation and building space, the plan recognizes the need to help Vermonters ready for the electric reality with panel and service upgrades to support more electrification in their homes. Quickly, there was a recognition to move quickly to 100% renewable energy. If we're going to lean more into electrifying a lot, we need to make sure that where we get that supply, it is as clean and required to get cleaner as possible, so that it nods to the expansion of new and in-state generation as a priority. And then smart growth and land use and agricultural sequestration and substitution and non-energy were big priorities of the plan. And we're going to get into that in a lot more detail shortly. But what does this all mean for us this year? For Vnrc, we really, again, look at the climate plan as a blueprint. We think we have a lot of work to do quickly, and we have to do it very thoughtfully and prioritize equity and justice in it. So for us, highlight of the priorities that we have for this session, starting first with enacting an environmental justice policy as an overarching framework for the state of Vermont to do this work well over time, and then continuing to do more to ensure we prioritize through process and policy design and program delivery and incentive priorities the needs of lower income, historically marginalized Vermonters. So enacting an environmental justice policy is a really critical priority for Vnrc. Quickly, before I turn it over to John, this is a high level overview of our other priorities this session, and we are going to dig into the deeply in an ensuing webinar. But we are looking for the legislature and the governor to support the investment of at least $150 million in a range of climate initiatives. And that includes, embedded within that is the enactment of the Transportation Innovation Act, which is a really broad-based transportation bill that was just introduced with 60 sponsors this week, that really puts our shoulder behind far more vehicle electrification, diversification of our transit system, and important programs that help communities reduce vehicle miles traveled and transition to cleaner transportation. Weatherization for all, that will be a big budget conversation, and the necessary investment needs to be made there to help people start saving dramatically on their heating and energy bills. We are really looking forward to advancing that core prong of the climate action plan, the clean heat standard, and making sure that that is strong, accountable to our greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements, and transparent. Looking to Representative Laura Sebelia's bill on municipal fuel switching and efficiency. This will very much help municipalities reduce their fossil fuel reliance through strategic fuel switching investments. Looking to update the renewable energy standard, and then investing in the workforce development that we need to deploy these solutions across the state of Vermont. So I'm looking to getting into those details at an ensuing conversation with you all and an ensuing webinar. But in the meantime, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, our Water and Policy Program Director, John Groveman, who's going to take us into more detail about what resilience and adaptation means for us and for Vermont. Thanks, John.
Great. Thank you, Joey. That was terrific as always. So I'm John Groveman. I'm the Vnrc Policy and Water Program Director, and really grateful that so many of you can join us today. And as Joey said, this is a first of a series of webinars, and I really hope that you could join us for the next webinars we're going to do, because we're really going to drill into the specifics of what policies and actions Vnrc is calling the legislature and the governor to support with regard to climate, both the mitigation issues that Joey just reviewed, but what is called adaptation and resiliency, climate adaptation and resiliency. And as Brian noted, when Vnrc looks at what's happening, what we need to do to address climate change, and what the studies are showing, it really lines up with Vnrc's, the work we've really been doing for decades. But it's clearly the changes we need to make have just come, we're at a crossroads. And under the umbrella of climate adaptation and resiliency, we feel it's time to really take some bold steps on changing the way we deal with some of our natural resources in the state. So with that, Colin, I don't know if you want to share the PowerPoint now. So I'm going to go through a PowerPoint where I really want to just set the context for what is, what does climate resilience and adaptation mean? And I'm sure that, many of you, if not all of you, really know that, but I think it's important to take a step back and just, go over what we mean when we use those terms and how they manifest themselves in Vermont in particular. And what does that mean in terms of the changes that we need to make in Vermont to our policies? So why don't we just go to the next slide? So I wanted to zoom out at the beginning and basically just remind everyone, including myself, that Vermont, obviously we're not alone in this. We're part of the world, and the whole world is dealing with the issue of climate change. And whether it's mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, as Joey just reviewed, or it's adapting and making ourselves more resilient to deal with the impacts of climate change. This is something that the whole world is dealing with. United Nations, I think, has a really good screen on what does it mean? What does climate adaptation and resilience mean? And so they have a three-prong definition, which I think tracks really well with how we view it in Vermont and the work of the Climate Council. So the first bullet is resilient people and livelihoods. We live in a world where we know that we're vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and they're happening now. And so how do we create systems that allow people all over the world to react to climate change events and begin to have access to governmental and financial help to basically allow people to live in this new world that we're seeing. We want to mitigate the impacts of climate change, as Joey went over, but we're already seeing changes. So we need to look at how we can live with the impacts we're seeing. And just like the Climate Council, climate justice and environmental justice and a just transition is key to fairly and properly being able to adjust our systems as we deal with climate change. So the UN recognizes that, and so does Vermont. So next slide, Colin. The second bullet really focuses, the UN focuses on resilient businesses and economies. And if you read this paragraph, really what it means is that we have to recognize that whatever economic systems we have across the world that are being impacted by climate change, whether it's access to insurance to be able to exist as a big part of all the economic systems across the world, or how we deal with transportation and food production. And importantly, this is where in the second bullet, the United Nations recognizes our natural, water and ecological systems and how vital they are, not only to biodiversity, but to the economy. And we need, as part of responding to climate change, shore up those systems. And then the next slide, Colin. Up one, go back up one, if you would. Thank you. So then the next one is really kind of where Vnrc's adaptation and resilience focus is, and that's in creating resilient environmental systems. I think that the UN says it well, that, nature and the mosaic of terrestrial and marine ecosystems is the first line of defense against climate risks from extreme weather events and disasters. And we need to shore up those natural systems. The loss of biodiversity is a tremendous concern with climate change, and we need to shore up this natural systems and protect the biodiversity that we have and we are currently losing, and how we grow food and how we manage our soils and our forests is key, and to being resilient. So that's the United Nations view on resilience and adaptation. And you can see, it's basically common sense. It's how people live, how we run our economy, how we protect our natural world. We need to shore those systems up, recognizing the changes that we're seeing while we're trying to mitigate those impacts through all the steps that Joey outlined. Next slide. So let's zoom into Vermont. So like coming out from the United Nations, looking at the world scale. So what's happening in Vermont? I think it's important first to recognize that we are experiencing the effects of climate change in Vermont now. And I know you all know that, living here, you see it. Next slide. The most obvious example, we lived through Tropical Storm Irene. Next slide. And you can just see a picture of that, which we've all seen, but it's important to remind ourselves of what the impacts could be. Next slide. And Brian mentioned this in his remarks. The UVM Gun Institute issued a really important and detailed report just this past November, summarizing the impacts of climate change in Vermont. Next slide. And you should go click the link to the report, but the big takeaways are basically confirming what we're feeling. The temperature is rising, the almost 2-degree Fahrenheit rise in temperature over the study period, and as they describe, whopping 21% increase in precipitation since 1900. Next slide. These are just more details on those findings. And it really is incredible to see the winter temperatures have increased 2.5 times faster than average since 1960. The precipitation increases, the impacts on our infrastructure, on our farms, is really been, it's like I said, this confirms what we've all been feeling in Vermont. So you should go really click on this report. Next slide. And importantly, really kind of getting to, what I think what Vnrc is going to focus on in terms of policy changes. The report outlines that we're seeing more droughts and more floods, more extreme events. For wildlife, roughly 70 bird species are expected to disappear from Vermont in the next 25 years. Climate change is making conditions, as we've heard, less favorable to some of our iconic tree species. We're seeing more invasive species. We're seeing warmer waters and the impact on warmer waters, and the habitat in those waters. And so those are some of the key issues that, as I talk about what Vnrc is going to recommend. And I apologize for my dog, but someone just came up to the house working from home. And I wanted to note that the Climate Action Plan, if you go to it, and I try to put in some page numbers, does a great job of listing impacts that are captured in the UVM report and in other reports as well. So go check out the Climate Action Plan in addition to that UVM link, to really get a sense of what the impacts that we're seeing here in Vermont. Next slide. So what do we do in Vermont? What does Vnrc think we should focus on to deal with these impacts? What does the Climate Action Plan say about resiliency and adaptation to these impacts in Vermont? Next slide. So I wanted to go to the next slide. The CAP itself, the CAP does a good job. There's a lot in the CAP about adaptation and resilience. And in the interest of time, I won't read these slides, but I cite to them in the presentation, and I'm sure that these presentations could be made available. But there's a recognition that Vermont needs to basically change its policies so we can deal with this increased rain and flooding events, and we could address the loss of species that we're seeing. Next slide. And importantly, again, and this comes up, again and again and again throughout the climate action plan, the need for a just transition to recognize environmental justice, which is why, as Joey noted, the top of the list policies is to get an environmental justice policy in Vermont. And this is clearly recognized in the climate action plan. Next slide. So there's a lot in the CAP, the climate action plan, in terms of adaptation and resilience. Vnrc, these are the issues that are identified in the CAP as changes we need to make to our policies that Vnrc is proposing this year, specific changes. And the future webinars are going to do a deep dive into these. So in the climate action plan, there's a call to change Vermont's land use policies. So we know that future growth is going to be adaptive and resilient to climate change. Next slide. They're right in the climate action plan. There's a lot in there about farm and forest viability. There's a recognition that we need to take a range of steps to manage our farms and forests in a way to have healthy soils and healthy forests, to maintain biodiversity and address the species loss that I noted. Next slide. And land use, and Joey mentioned it, comes up over and over again in terms of adaptation, people living where they work and play, as Joey mentioned, and to reduce their transportation carbon footprint, and to basically take pressure off of developing natural resources outside of where we've already developed and have infrastructure that supports development. Next slide. This is a slide about water infrastructure. I'm not going to read it. You can go to it, but it basically supports the notion that we have to do much more to not only upgrade our physical infrastructure, but have use our natural systems that help mitigate flooding, like wetlands and river corridors. And this is from the Climate Action Plan. Next slide. And so now let's get into an outline of the specific policies. We're not going to go into details today. That's what the future webinars are for. Next Friday, we're going to have a webinar focused really on the water resources policies. Next slide, and I'll just kind of review what we're going to be talking about. So really, we're focused on the water and water resources, looking at better increased wetland protections. Wetlands are habitat for a variety of species, help mitigate flood impacts, river corridors and riparian areas. Protecting forests addresses biodiversity issues, helps also mitigate flood events, also sequesters carbon. And we're really going to get into the specific policies in the coming webinars. Last slide, I think the next slide is the last slide. Here's a little bit more detail. For forests, we're calling for improving land use protections through improving our land use policies, specifically Act 250, our tax policies, our current use tax program and incentives, and better conservation of forest land through what's known as the 30 by 30 program. And we'll have a webinar really drilling into all of that. As I said, water, we're going to be talking about wetlands policy changes, and there's a bill in the legislature calling for policies that would have us gain wetlands instead of lose wetlands, money for mapping of wetlands so we know how to avoid them, reduce wetland exemptions, better protect wetlands, river corridors, and riparian areas along our rivers and streams. And then sustainable communities will have a whole presentation on how do we strengthen smart growth policies, how do we improve Act 250 to promote smart growth and have better land use planning, better zoning, and transportation. So that is the overview. And I think it went a little long, so hopefully not too long. I'm going to turn it over to Sheldon now and go from there. So take it away, Sheldon.
Thanks, John. Thank you so much, Brian, Joey, and John, for this great overview of climate mitigation as well as adaptation. Like John mentioned, we're going to be getting into more details in the coming weeks as we get into deeper dive webinars. But my name is Sheldon Goodwin, and I'm the Political Outreach Director for Vermont Conservation Voters, or VCV. And before we get to the Q&A, I just wanted to give a brief background on VCV. VCV works alongside Vnrc to advocate for these important issues that we mentioned today in the legislature. We also focus on holding legislators accountable with our environmental scorecard. We will be updating the scorecard as key environmental votes happen throughout the legislative session, and will then publish an official scorecard next summer to educate voters like you on their legislators' environmental voting records. VCV also works to help elect pro-environmental lawmakers, so we'll have an exciting year ahead of us. And we'll soon be rolling out our 2022 Environmental Common Agenda of legislative priorities, which is a joint project among many of the leading environmental organizations. The issues you heard today will be front and center, as well as some additional environmental priorities. So mark your calendars for Wednesday, January 26th at 6 p.m. for a virtual event where we will discuss this year's common agenda. So now we're going to have time for Q&A. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as possible. So let's see if we have any questions. So our first question, I think, would be best answered by Joey. Is there a kind of a breakdown in the climate action plan between mitigation strategies and adaptation strategies? Is there a preference for one or the other, or is it evenly split between the two? Joey? Maybe not.
What was the question again, Sheldon?
The kind of breakdown and split between mitigation and adaptation strategies in the climate action plan. Is there a priority of one or the other? And how should we go about prioritizing the two?
I will take it. Oh, there's Joey. There you go.
Sorry about that. So there's not really, I mean, the plan sets out a broad framework, and the pollution reductions are the current only statutorily required measurement of progress. But at the same time, there is no sort of concrete way to measure that, but there's just a deep commitment to and a recognition that we have to do both and when it comes to mitigation, resilience, and adaptation. And that's, to be honest with you, some of the work that we need to do moving forward. We delivered this initial plan. The Climate Council meets on the 24th of January, and part of the conversation there is what does our ensuing work look like? And some of that work will be informed by some technical analyses that the ANR has commissioned and are required, including things like a municipal vulnerability index. There will be some work to analyze life cycle greenhouse gas emission accounting. And so all of that information, I think, is intended to really inform, ongoing work and prioritization setting. So there is no formulaic approach, but just a deep recognition to the need to do all of it.
Thank you. And the next question is, with the governor being opposed to the Global Warming Solutions Act, are you thinking implementation will be more difficult?
I mean, I guess I'll take that, but I would say that, again, the state of Vermont and him in particular, the State Agency of Natural Resources is on the hook legally to make progress. And so I think it is a different dynamic than what I had shared with you, which is that we've had these pollution reduction goals on the books statutorily since 2006, but we haven't made progress because we have not been required to. Well, now we are required to. The Agency of Natural Resources, I think, has really shown up in this endeavor. And it is my hope and it is my assumption that they recognize that they have a legal obligation and that they are committed to, and the governor will need to be committed to the actual enactment of the policies and the programs to move us forward. So, we'll see. He still wields a veto pen, but I think the hope would be that the climate action plan is pretty clear about where we need to be focused, and then that sets a different political tone. But clearly, we're going to need you all to continue to partner with us to ensure that this is possible, and that's where the work of VCV also comes into in terms of the accountability metrics of it all.
Yeah, can I add to that too? And as Mary, who asked the question, knows as well as anyone, this administration has dealt with most challenging questions by letting the legislature lead, and it's going to really require legislative leadership, and we are seeing an indication that exists, and so we're really pleased with that. And I'd also just say, and partly because of the work of VCV, the governor opposed the Global Warming Solutions Act, but it still was passed into law. So, where there's a legislative leadership, there's a way forward.
Okay, our next question is, what are some strategies for finding common ground with the agricultural sector in addressing climate change in Vermont?
I guess I'll take that one. I think that there's a recognition, there is some common ground, and there's a recognition in the agricultural sector that what they have been doing has not been working economically, and that there's an agreement that soil health is a really important issue, and soil health is so key to dealing with sequestering carbon and also reducing pollution. But I think we're in a flex time, we're in a transition time, and groups like Vnrc are, we're going to continue to grind it out and kind of work towards a more sustainable agricultural future. And it's difficult because we're transitioning from the way we've done things for hundreds of years, literally. So I think there is some common ground. You'll see a lot of articles in the paper. The media does like to, kind of go to the controversy points, but I think that there are policies that we're working on, but I'm not going to sugarcoat it and say it's not difficult to make this transition. And I think, it takes all the advocacy of groups like Vnrc and people like you that support us to try to make that transition. In the land use, in the water webinar next week, I'll talk more specifically about some of the farm policies.
Awesome, thanks, John. Our next question is more of a kind of logistical question. What's the best way to stay up to date about the key bills and where they are in the legislative process, as well as kind of how does one advocate for these different policies that are coming up before the legislature?
I'll take that, Sheldon. And if you go to either VNRC or VCV's webpage, you can sign up for our email alerts, and we will send out action alerts to let people know how they can weigh in on issues at the appropriate time when it can be most impactful. VCV, Lauren Hurl and Sheldon provide a weekly wrap up of what's going on in the State House during the session, so you can sign up for that on VCV's webpage. And we are always available to talk to anybody who wants to understand what some of the issues that are before a particular committee in the legislature are doing, and give you whatever advice we can on how you can weigh in.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for attending and for being here with us. Look forward to more webinars in the near future that will give a deep dive into these issues that we briefly touched on today. And thank you so much for being here.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.